Hi everyone, welcome back to Richmond Public Library Presents Young Writers Workshop. I'm Mr. Lewis from the Ginter Park Library, and today we're going to be talking about genre, that is the category of books. So what a book contains, what it's about, and how it is classified. We'll talk about it from the perspective of a reader and as a writer. All right, let's get started. So in this video, we're going to be talking about what genre basically is, how we define it. I'll give you a general list of the fiction genres, although it's be very incomplete because the actual list is incredibly long. We'll talk about the overlap of different genres and how each story can be parts of multiple genres. We'll talk about tropes, which are elements of genres that are generally specific to certain genres. And we'll talk about forcing a genre and why it's a bad idea to do so. Okay, here we go. So the first question we have to ask is, what is genre? Basically, genre is the way we categorize stories. All right, specifically in this case, written work, but any story really has a genre, right? And the genre is based generally on the setting of the story, so where or when it takes place. So you have things like historical fiction, if it takes place in the past, sci-fi, if it takes place like in a futuristic setting, fantasy, if it exists in a world that is not our own, things like that. All right. It can also refer to the author's intent. Some authors intend to educate. All right. A lot of nonfiction stories, or nonfiction books, I should say, are all about education. Some books are categorized as comedy. They want to make you laugh. Some books are meant to scare you, like a horror story is meant to scare you. So we categorize books by the author's intent. We also categorize by audience. So who is the intended audience? Who does the author intend to read their story? So we have children's books, we have adult books, we have middle grade books, we have YA books, all right, things like that. But it's important to note that each genre has multiple subgenres, which also have their own subgenres, and they have their own subgenres, etc. All right. What I mean by this is that each genre can include other genres within them. All right. So to give you a very easy example, there are really only two primary genres, fiction and nonfiction. So made up stories and information. Right? Made up stories, information. And everything beyond them are just subgenres of those two main genres, fiction and nonfiction. All right. So just to give you an idea of some examples of genre, I will give you a very simple and very incomplete list. There are literally over 100 kinds of genres out there, so this is a very basic list. All right, so first of all, we have things like classics slash literary fiction. These are stories that are very character driven. All right, so the stories are more interested in how the characters act, think, grow, rather than an event. So stories like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, all right, or Where the Red Fern Grows, or Old Yeller. Those are classics, and they are literary fiction. All right, things like folklore, which are stories that generally have a message or a lesson for you to learn. All right, or they are a type of mythology, which is basically meant to explain natural phenomenon. Right, romance, which is all about relationships. All right, how relationships can grow and how two characters can eventually fall in love, things like that. Action slash adventure. These two are often grouped together, but you can have one without the other. But generally, anything that involves a lot of action falls under this category. Sports, exactly what it says, stories that are about athletes or about sports in general. Fantasy, stories that take place in another world. Fantasy usually has some form of magical element, all right? A force of something that cannot really be explained by science, all right? Sometimes fantasy will take place in a different world, different reality, but there are fantasies that take place on, everyday Earth. They just have a fantastical element to them. Science fiction, similar to fantasy, but whereas fantasy deals mostly with things like magic and things like that, science fiction deals with science and technology. All right, so you still have otherworldly aspects to your story, but they are explained by science rather than magic. Right? Mystery stories. All right, the author presents you an issue, a mystery. Something has happened, and it's up to you, the reader, to try to find out what it is, to try to figure it out. The author will give you hints and clues along the way before giving you the reveal at the end. All right, thriller. Thrillers are suspense stories, stories that are meant to make you feel anxious and a little bit worried. It's similar to horror, whereas horror is more about trying to scare you and give you that creepy feeling. Thriller is more meant to excite you, to make you want to read more, to get to the next part. All right, thrillers often go hand in hand with action slash adventure. All right, horror, like I said, there are stories that are meant to scare you. Historical fiction is stories that take place in a specific moment, in an event or time period in the past. It takes place at a moment in history. All right, a good example of this would be the I Survive series, if you are familiar with those, that they take place in specific events in history. They can tell fictional stories, so the stories themselves are made up, but they take place during an event or a time period that actually happened. So let's talk about genre overlap. Basically, no book falls into only a single genre. All right, every book has multiple genres, multiple tags, multiple labels that can be put onto it. All right, your book could be about a fantasy story, but it also could have action adventure in it. It could be a romance. It could be a horror. It could be a thriller. It could be a mystery. All right, you are not limited to one genre per book. All right. Now, stories do have different focuses that determine which genre is that story's primary genre, like how we would categorize it, like in a bookstore or in a library, right? But every story has more than one. And it's interesting because some books are more known for one genre than another, all right? One story that has similar elements to another story might be labeled an action adventure, whereas the other one, which has, like I said, similar elements to it, might be labeled as a fantasy, even though they both have both elements. Now, how does this apply to your writing? Basically, what it means is that there isn't really a specific genre that you should focus on. Okay? Just write your story. You don't have to think, I'm going to write a romance novel, or I'm going to write a science fiction story. You can want to do that, but the focus shouldn't be on the labels. The focus shouldn't be on the genre. The focus should be on your story, right? Focus more on writing a good story rather than writing a specific kind of story, right? The one exception to this would be audience, because if you're writing a children's story, then it has to be specifically written for children. Whereas if you're writing a book for like young adults, you would write it specifically for young adults. That would determine the language you use, things like that. Right? But other than that, don't feel like you have to focus on one genre. Focus on your story. All right? And don't be afraid to mix genres. Right? Some of the best stories out there are mixtures of genres and not just the intent, like the sci-fi, the horror, the comedy, the romance. You can have all of those elements in one story, but you can even mix up like the settings. A good example of this actually is Star Wars. What is Star Wars? What genre is it? It's science fiction, right? I mean, that makes sense. But you know what? There's also elements of fantasy in it. The Force, Jedi are basically just wizards. I mean, think about it. But that's just the setting. I mean, is Star Wars action adventure? Is it thriller? Is it comedy? It has all of those elements to it. But how would you label it specifically? Like I said, the primary genre for Star Wars is generally considered to be science fiction, but it has so many other elements to it, and that's what I'm talking about. You can mix almost any genre. You could have a Western in space, all right? You could have historical fiction that's also a fantasy, All right, so don't be afraid to mix genres when you're telling a story. Again, focus on telling your story rather than trying to fit a genre. So now we're going to talk about some of those elements that I mentioned that basically are enable you to put a book in a specific genre, to label a book. All right, we call these elements or themes tropes. All right, and there are actually two main kinds of tropes. There are genre tropes and literary tropes. We're going to be talking about genre tropes today. Literary tropes are a little bit different. They are for writing style, so things like metaphors and foreshadowing. Those are all examples of literary tropes. They're all about the way something is written as opposed to the content. Genre tropes are more about the content. So tropes are themes or elements of a story that are common in different types of stories. So you have different stories, but they all have similar elements. Okay? So like fantasy stories, a lot of them have a magic system. You don't have to have a magic system in order to have a fantasy story, but that is a common theme in fantasy stories. Okay, um, something like laser weaponry in science fiction. All right, not every science fiction story has to have laser weapons, but it is a very common element. All right, so a good example of this would be The Chosen One. This is in a lot of stories. It's in fantasy and science fiction predominantly, but it has shown up in other types of stories as well. The Chosen One is basically the element of there is a character, usually it's the main character, but not always, who is destined by fate to fix whatever the big wrong that is going on in the world is. All right. So there's always a prophecy involved. There's something that has decided that this person has been chosen to be the one to fix everything. All right. And a lot of authors have taken that and kind of turned it around, making it seem like the main character is the chosen one and then it's not, or sometimes it's played completely straight. All right. Harry Potter, they literally call him the chosen one at certain points. All right. So that's a very well known trope. Now, most tropes aren't bad or good inherently. Sometimes people will talk about tropes in a negative way, but honestly, tropes by themselves are not bad. They're just themes. They're just aspects of your story. But they can be done very badly. All right? And we generally think of bad tropes as cliches. All right? They're things that are done over and over and over again to the point that it's almost insulting to the reader that you continue to use them. Okay? So cliches are a little bit different. You want to try to avoid cliches. All right? But you can't avoid tropes. Every story uses different tropes. Sometimes it uses it completely straight, like I said. Sometimes it does it in a creative way. So however you use tropes, it's fine to use them. Okay? Just make it your own. That's the important thing about tropes, is that it's not bad to use them if you make them your own. So don't write a story specifically with the intention of using a trope because you feel that you have to in order to make it fit into a genre. Instead, you can use those tropes, those themes in your story, but make it part of your story, part of your story. Work it, fix it, do something to it that makes it yours. Okay? Now, there is a lot that can go into tropes. There are websites devoted just to tropes. All right? So this is just a very, very basic idea of what tropes are and how they're used. But just so you have a general idea of the idea that there are themes that are common throughout a lot of stories that are generally specific to genre, but not always. Okay? So just be aware of them. So just to kind of wrap things up here, I want to talk a little bit about forcing a genre and why you shouldn't try to force a genre. Okay? Just because some stories in a particular genre contain a certain trope or an element doesn't mean that yours needs to. Okay, maybe you've been reading other stories in a genre that you want to write, or you've read authors that write in a genre that you want to write, and you've noticed things that they do. You can use those elements if you want. You can use some of those same themes, but you don't have to in order to fit that genre. Okay? The main thing to remember is that this is your story. All right? And even if other people don't consider it necessarily a specific genre first and foremost, that really isn't as important. Right? It's your story. And while certain elements are needed for a story to be considered part of a genre, all right, you decide how those elements are used. Okay? So what I mean is, if you want a sci-fi story, it doesn't have to have laser weaponry at all. It doesn't have to be in the future. It could even be in the past if you want. It could be an alternate reality. The main thing is that it's something that is different from our world, our reality. And the main difference is through technology of some kind. That's the main thing for sci-fi. It's science fiction, right? But there are elements that you can't do without, right? A mystery novel has to have a mystery. If it doesn't have a mystery, it's not a mystery story, right? If you have a romance story that doesn't have a romance in it between two characters, then it's not a romance, right? So there are certain things that you have to have in order to be considered a genre, but that's not as important as the story. The story is what's important. It's your story. So try not to worry too much about the genre of your story. Okay? If you want, you can look up different tropes for this genre of story that you are trying to write, but focus more on how you want to write your story. You can get ideas from other places. There are plenty. That's a great thing. Get as much information from as many different places as possible. That will always help you. But ultimately, it comes down to this is your story. You write it how you want. Don't worry about tropes. Don't worry about how other people have written their stories in the same genre. Focus on your story. Okay? And whatever you decide to write, just write. Thank you all so much for joining me for this video. I hope you found it enjoyable and informative, and I'll see you all for the next video.